Turning to class 11, our second to last class, where we take on the last two chapters of volume 2 on Marx's reproduction schema. On the one hand, are lauded as one of Marx's most important contributions to economics. Some people trace the birth of macroeconomic growth theory to these ideas, as well as citing this as one of the first two-sector modelings of the economy that exists. But on the other hand, there's quite a bit of controversy over what Marx intended these reproduction schemas to show. And I'm wondering, given his kind of lack of framing around the discussion of reproduction schemas and the fact that we know that they're kind of put together from two different treatments, how do you understand what Marx is trying to get at with the reproduction schema? What work do they do in his argument?
You often have to read Marx for little clues as to, and very often these clues occur in occasional sentences here and there, and as you know, I'm often prone to look at footnotes and things like that to extract actually an explanation of what he's doing because it's buried in a footnote somewhere. There are some passages towards the end of the reproduction schemas where he kind of says, well, this whole system could possibly be in equilibrium, but if it is so, it is purely by accident. And that the possibility of it remaining in equilibrium is really pretty remote. And so he does say that at some point. So what I would read into that is that what he's trying to do here is to say what it is that capitalism should do, would have to do if it wanted to survive in a crisis-free mode, in order to show that it can't possibly be in that crisis-free mode, given the nature of capitalist social relations and the way the market system works, and how individual capitalists are going to do all the kinds of things they do without any kind of discipline being exerted upon them. So I see him as sort of really talking about something that would be necessary for capitalism to achieve if it wanted balanced growth, but it never will achieve. That's how I generally interpret it. And there's evidence in the text which you can point to that says that that is the way he's thinking about it. But he becomes so enamored of trying to figure out exactly what it is that he forgets to kind of mention this throughout much of it. So it does make it seem, as somebody like Rosa Luxemburg complained, that there can be balanced growth forever. Now there's another controversial aspect of it, which is that the suggestion that in a communist society you could indeed achieve balanced growth by using these as planning tools. And indeed in the early Soviet Union and some of the 5-year plans that were laid out in India and so on have actually tried to use a framework of this kind for a planned, centrally planned economy. So the sort of history of the utilization of these things is very interesting, both in terms of socialist but also in terms of capitalist dimensions. Now, in Marx's time, of course, there was no attempt at macroeconomic interventions in the economy. And the growth models which, to some degree came out of these formulations, the Howard-Domar model and so on at the end of the 1930s into the 1940s, and then growth theory in general, attempts to create a sort of initially a Keynesian framework for macroeconomic modeling which would stabilize the economy. And of course these are much more elaborate models than the one that Marx laid out, but the idea is there in Marx, and I think many people have appreciated it, even if they have failed to acknowledge it. I mean, Keynes knew about it but didn't know about it. He never acknowledged the significance of these of Marx's contributions. Okay, so we're in the middle of the reproduction schemas, both simple reproduction and expanded reproduction. Of course, they're terrifically clear, easily understood, so I really don't have to say anything, right? I mean, I think one of the things we have to do is to sort of sit back and say, all right, well, what's the framework here, and then sort of speculate a little bit about what the purpose is, because it's not at all clear entirely what Marx's purpose is. you can only infer it. The framework is, as we talked about last time, is that Marx divides the economy into two departments. And yeah, he messes around with a third department of luxury goods, but doesn't really go that far with it. But basically it's a two-department model. And the two departments are producing means of production and consumer goods. And then he's interested in trading relations. And really, there are two kinds of trading relations which get talked about in these chapters. And it's a bit like if you thought of these two departments as two different countries, you would say, okay, there are trading relations inside of the country and then trading relations between countries. So there's trading relations which exist inside of the department producing means of production and trading relations inside of the department that is producing wage goods. And then there's trade between the two departments. Now, I think the fundamental argument is really about the trade between departments, but there are several sections where he spends a lot of time talking about the trading that's going on within departments. And in department of producing means of production, you have a slightly complicated kind of situation in which means of production are being produced to produce means of production. And it goes on ad infinitum. And sometimes those means of production are produced within a particular sector. And Marx uses the argument of, well, you're producing corn, and so one of the means of production of corn is corn seeds, and you produce the corn seeds, and then you save the corn seeds, and then next year you use the corn seeds. So corn seeds are your constant capital, which then passed on year by year by year. But most of the time what's happening is that there are particular industries or particular capitalists producing means of production who are producing the means of production for other capitalists. So that, for example, the capitalist producing machinery needs steel, so steel is an input into machinery, and so it goes on. The reason why Marx actually talks about this a little bit, and it becomes even more significant in the section on expanded reproduction, is because situations can arise in which certain capitalists who are, want to consume those means of production, they want to buy a machine, say, but they haven't got the money to buy it. They need actually 2 or 3 years to save the money, so we get that dreaded word which is cropped up throughout Volume 2 of Capital a lot, which is hoarding. That you need to hoard money for maybe 3 or 4 years before you can buy the machine. During those years you may be producing, sending commodities out into the market and getting money for them, but you're not actually consuming, because you're saving a part of what's coming in. So Marx is kind of saying, well, this produces the possibility for imbalances within, and particularly within the sector which is producing means of production. And you have all sorts of other issues that arise here which are about, well, what about repair and replacement? You're probably going to have to save up for that too. So the likelihood that everything is going to be sort of hunky-dory inside of this sector called the production of means of production, the idea that that's all going to run smoothly is erroneous, and Marx kind of suggests that there are many possibilities for disruptions and inequalities, that there's too much demand or there's too much supply. And so we're going to get some real possibilities of inequalities and the like, and those inequalities could potentially be the source of some sort of more major disruption. So throughout this, we will find these sections where Marx is talking about the circulation of constant capital inside of the sector producing means of production. The same issue doesn't really arise in the other, in the production of consumer goods, because there you will find, to the degree, as Marx makes very clear, not only is he assuming that the workers are not saving, and to the degree that he's saying that workers are always under pressure to spend what they get immediately, and to the degree that workers are paid by the week, so you don't find the same potentiality for disruptions in the sector that is producing wage goods. So Marx does not pay as much attention to the sector producing wage goods as he does to the sector producing means of production. So one of the things that's going on in these chapters is a discussion of the internal trading that's going on in these two sectors. And sometimes it muddles up and gets muddled into the trade that's going on between sectors. And you can see how that can also, one can spill over into the other. But the main innovation here is to come up with a model, if you like, of the trade between the sectors. And it's very interesting here that what he does is to set out a whole set of different calculations based on numerical calculations, which frankly, if you go through one, then you have to go through another, and it gets into decimal points and all this kind of stuff, and you're kind of going, well, I'm not quite sure where this is all going. So I think we're going to try and simplify that to just one basic example. And the place where he does this, I think, the place I would start from is on page 586. What Marx does here is to set out this schema of simple reproduction. We start with Department 1, we have this 4,000 C plus 1,000 V plus 1,000 S. That's Department 1, which gives you 6,000. And then Department 2, when he does this first time round, is 2,000 C plus 500 V plus 500 S, 3,000. And he works with that one on simple reproduction. And what he works out is that this amount here, the 2,000 C, has to be equivalent to that. And if we did that in this kind of other way that we can do it algebraically, we would say that Department 1, it's C1 plus V1 plus S1. Department 2 is C2 plus V2 plus S2, and which equals the total output, call it W. And that the equilibrium position is that C2 equals V1 plus S1. So if you want to do it algebraically, you do it like that. Okay, so that's the algebraic version of it. Now, interestingly, what he does when he's talking about expanded reproduction is that he changes the figures down here, and some interesting reasons why. He changes the ratios. This means that the two departments are identical, except that one is more capital intensive than the other. That is, the organic composition of capital, which you remember is the ratio of C over V, is different in the two departments. This is 2 to 1, and that's 4 to 1. Now, why he did that is kind of an interesting kind of question. Now, what I've done is to pass around this sheet, and I'm going to sort of go through it sort of as we go through. The question that arises then, and as you see, what we now find in this is that there's not an equilibrium between this and this. That in fact, what we're now going to see, however, is a breaking down of the S into something different. That is, the big question that really arises in expanded reproduction is, what are we going to do with the surplus value? So this is, if you like, the key figure. What do we do with this? And in expanded reproduction, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to take part of that and reinvest it. So what that turns into, and so this then turns into, as you reinvest it, at the end of the year, say, you kind of reallocate it in the following kind of way. You say, all right, we'll have 4,000 C, but we now have to think about the reinvestment. How much are we going to reinvest in extra means of production? And Marx kind of puts it this way, well, we'll have 400 C, and then, of course, we have, again, the 1,000 V, plus we need more labor power, and we need it in the ratio of 400, so it's 100 V extra, which is the delta V, if you like. So these are the delta signs, the extra amount, and this is the extra amount here. So extra, extra, and then that leaves a residual, which is left over for bourgeois consumption, which is 500S. Okay? So that is the reinvestment which is going on in Department 1. In Department 2, you have a parallel reinvestment strategy in which, again, you have the 1,500 C. You then need some extra means of production, and you have 100 C plus 750 V, which is the original, plus the 50 V, which is, and then that leaves you 600S. In which case, we're going to be talking about, this is now equal to 4,400, and this is now equal to 1,600. So we've expanded this to 4,400 C, 1,600 C, plus 1,100 V, plus 500 S, plus, and this one goes 800 V, plus 600 S. What you here see is that the equivalence which was initially required is set up here. So that is equivalent to that. So that is the equilibrium condition. That is the equilibrium structure of reinvestment in Departments 1 and Departments 2. Now what you do then is you then, what Marx then does in there is to say, all right, well, what does this look like in the second year? Well, what you do is you take all of those figures from over there and you bring them back over here and say, well, in the second year it looks like this. We're going to start off with 4,400 C, and we've now got 1,100 V. And if the same rate of surplus value operates, and Marx keeps the rate of surplus value constant, now we've got 1,100 S. And, of course, that means that we've got a total of 6,600 total. Similarly, in Department 2, we take all of those figures from over here and say this is the new production system which is going to be in operation, which is 1,600 C plus 800 V plus 800 S, and that equals 3,200. Now what you notice here is that the total output here is 9,000, and the total output here is 9,800. So you've expanded the system by 800 units in the second year. Now you then do the same to this again as you did up there, and you get the figures that then flow on from that. When we come over here, we look at it and we say, all right, we've got the 4,400 C, and we now need the extra C, which is 440 C. We've got the original V plus 110 V, and then that leaves 550 S, and that is 4,840. And the same thing we do with this down here. We get 1,600 C plus 160 C plus 800V plus 80V plus 560S gives us 1760, and then we put this all together in a different kind of way. Again, just amalgamating all of this, so we end up with 4840C plus 1210V plus 550S. And down here we have 1760C plus 880V plus 560S. And we again notice that that is equivalent to that. And then what I've done is to take you through year 3 and year 4, and you just keep on going. Now, these sorts of figures are consistent with this simple algebraic formula that no matter what, under conditions of extended reproduction, C2 plus the delta C2 must equal the total of the it'll be the V1 plus the delta V1 plus whatever's left over on the SO, so that we have that equation system fixed. Now, these, if you like, are simply, kind of a way in which Marx has worked out what it would take for the trading system between the two departments to keep the ratios right, so that you didn't have overproduction in one department or underproduction in another department and vice versa. Okay? And he works these sorts of figures out and then of course adds in various other complications and all the rest of it. But this is the basic argument. And is this sort of clear, or are you kind of so bemused by all of the kind of adding things up and everything? You clear about this? I mean, it's not that hard. You just have to keep on going and sort of say, oh, well, this sort of. You okay with it? Right. Well, there are a number of issues that are then raised, which I think I would like to sort of take up. The first is really to look at the nature of the assumptions which are embedded in this system. And the first obvious assumption is that you can clearly distinguish these two departments, and it's very clear what is producing means of production and what is producing something else. And of course there are a lot of industries where actually they're producing both. Agriculture is a good example. If you're raising cattle and you're raising them to be draft animals, then you're raising means of production. If you're going to eat them for meat, they're in the consumption sphere. So, but Marx is assuming that these sectors are clearly distinguishable from each other. The second thing is that he is, and this comes up fairly frequently, and I wrote some of the bits and pieces down, so maybe I'll try and give them to you. He also assumes that there are only two classes in society. We mentioned this last time. And at various points in the text, he kind of says, well, of course there are bankers and landlords and the state and taxes and all those kinds of things around. And the merchants may get in here and get into the trading game and all this sort of thing. But then he uses the argument and says, but at some point or other, they all have to derive their revenues and derive what they're getting from the production of surplus value. So if you like, he tries to legitimize what he's doing here very much by simply saying, all right, all of those other sectors, the landlords, for example, are essentially parasitic upon the production of surplus value elsewhere. The merchant, as we saw in the theory on merchants' capital, actually derives their income from a cut out of surplus value production. So Marx is kind of saying, I don't think by introducing all those other classes, I'm actually going to improve matters at all. I'll just muddy the waters so that we can't really see what is truly going on. So the second assumption, but the second assumption about two-class society also makes some assumptions about how those classes are going to behave. One of the things we assume is that workers consume all that they get. They don't save. As comes up as you go through the text, this stuff about rational consumption on the part of the workers is also there. You assume they're going to consume in such a way as it matches what is being produced. So the sector producing wage goods is producing the kinds of goods that workers want to consume or need to consume and will consume. So there's assumption of that sort. There's another assumption here, which is, what are we assuming about capitalist behavior in terms of reinvestment? Well, why are they reinvesting? And there Marx refers us back to Volume 1 and kind of says they're reinvesting because the coercive laws of competition force them to. So they're reinvesting because of the state of competition. But how they reinvest, and why would they reinvest in exactly these proportions? It's not clear at all that there was any market signals that tells them what they are or what they should be. There's no way, in fact, in which individual capitalists operating in their own self-interest are likely in aggregate to produce a result where the aggregate reinvestment in Department 1 is exactly what it needs to be in order to get this whole thing moving. So we therefore get the real possibility of disjunctions between individual capitalist behavior and even capitalist class behavior and the requirements that would be there for the reproduction of a capitalist system. So not only is there an assumption that there are only two classes, but we assume certain things about the behavior of these two classes in this model, which, and to the degree that that behavior it doesn't exist and that workers may save or may spend on things that, other things than they should, to the degree that that happens, then of course there's going to be a disequilibrium which enters into the picture. I mean, he starts out this whole thing about the two-class economy on page 468. This whole thing he's going to deal with is about the reproduction, i.e. maintenance, of the capitalist class and the working class, and hence to the reproduction of the capitalist character of the entire production process. So he declares it's a two-class thing. At various points he mentions the possibility of there being other classes. So on 497 he says, the division of surplus value into different categories, the bearers of which appear alongside the industrial capitalist as the landlord for ground rent, the money lender for interest, etc., as well as the government and its officials, rentier, etc. These fellows face the industrial capitalist as buyers and to this extent realize his commodities in money. They too cast their share of money into the circulation sphere and he receives this from them. What is always forgotten in connection with this are the sources from which they originally obtained this money and continue to obtain it. So that's on page 497. And on page 580, he says, since in this schema everything is in the hands of the capitalists in the two departments, and there are neither merchants nor money dealers involved, nor bankers, nor any classes that merely consume and are not directly involved in commodity production, it follows that. So we get this idea of the two-class economy and also certain behaviors. We also are assuming in this particular schema that everything sells, all commodities sell at their value, so the trading that goes on. Now in Volume 3, of capital, he argues that commodities don't sell at their values, they sell at something called costs of production, prices of production. But he doesn't consider that here. He just kind of says, okay, I'm going to forget all that for the moment. We're just going to assume it's a straight selling at values. The other thing is that the technology, of course, like all of Volume 2, is both stable, i.e., it doesn't change, and is productive. By that I mean that the technology has to be in a state where you can produce surplus value. So there is a minimum level of technology, if you like, which is assumed here. But any technology which is adequate to the production of surplus value can be deployed here, and whatever it is held constant. Now, obviously, that's not true. It's constantly, things are constantly changing. He also assumes that the wage rate or the value of labour power is fixed. So there are no shifts going on in Department 2 in terms of the value of labour power. And that, of course, is partly a consequence of or associated with the fact that there's no technological change, so there's no relative surplus value being produced here. So there's no, for that reason. But then the value of labour power also changes for other reasons, as we know. I mean, degree of civilization in the country, all those sorts of things. So the value of labour power is constant and doesn't change. And also, he insists at various points that you can't deal with any kind of problem. He doesn't allow people to deal with any problems by actually screwing a bit more out of labour. He has a passage where he kind of says, well, if the capitalists have had a hard time and they've lost something, then they try to actually recapture it by doing nasty things to labour in the living space. They extract surplus value from high rents and commodity wage goods that are I don't know, given a higher value than their real value. So. But he says, I can't allow you, that may go on in society in general, but in terms of my theoretical model, it's not helpful, so therefore I assume that the value of labour power is fixed, and you have to actually acknowledge that. And he sort of says, well, bourgeois critics have complained that I'm being unfair to the capitalist. In fact, he says I'm being very fair to them. I'm not saying they're screwing anybody at all. They're giving people the value of labour power, and so the model does depend on a constancy of what the value of labour power is about. So the wage rate can't be. For instance, on 584 to 5, which is just before, at the bottom there, he says, Department 2, considered as a totality, has the advantage over Department 1 that it not only buys labour power but resells its commodities to its own workers. As to how this fact can be exploited, there are the most palpable data in every industrial country. Even if the normal wage is nominally paid, a part of it can in actual fact be grabbed back without a corresponding equivalent, in other words, stolen. This is what I call accumulation by dispossession in the living space. This is achieved partly by way of the truck system and partly by falsification of the circulating medium. This is what happens in England and the USA. But then he goes on to say, we really can't accept all of this, because what we're talking about here is a real wage, and we see that in objective analysis of the capitalist mechanism, certain blemishes that still stick to it, and with extraordinary tenacity, cannot be used as subterfuges for getting around theoretical difficulties. So, again, he recognizes that these divergences exist, as also with the multi-class kind of thing, but says that it doesn't. I'm not really prepared to deal with that. He also assumes that there's an annual turnover, and the annual turnover, so we mentioned this last time, all of the kind of divergences that occur in turnover time. And he's got a problem with fixed capital, and occasionally he tries to sort of embed an understanding of fixed capital and repair and all this kind of stuff, particularly in terms of the circulation of capital in Department 1. So he's sort of concerned about that, but he can't really find a way to deal with the fact that fixed capital may carry over from one year to the next, except to kind of say, well, actually, we can just simply calculate it in terms of wear and tear and all this sort of thing. But clearly, it starts to have a very important role in Department 1 when people start to think about, expanding production, but in order to do that, they have to build a whole new factory, and they have to buy machines, and it needs a vast amount of hoarded capital. So the annual turnover is something which is assumed. He also assumes that the economy is closed, and so there's no foreign trade, and this comes up very specifically on page 544, where you may find a situation in which Department 1 has either to contract its production, which means a crisis for the workers and capitalists engaged in it, or to supply a surplus, which again leads to crisis. Of themselves, these surpluses are no evil, rather than an advantage. In capitalist production, however, they are an evil. Foreign trade could help in both cases. In the first, to exchange for means of consumption the commodities from Department 1 which are held fast in the money form. In the second, to dispose of the surplus commodities. But foreign trade, insofar as it does not just replace elements and their value, it only shifts the contradictions to a broader sphere and gives them a wider orbit. I think this is a very telling way of putting it, that actually what I call the spatial expansion and the spatial dynamics of capital, I would use this phrase to kind of say they never solve capital's problems, they simply expand those contradictions to a broader sphere and give them a wider orbit. So there's no overcoming the internal contradictions of capitalism by what I would call a spatial fix, by going outside and all this kind of stuff. You can't do it. And Marx, in Volume 1, in the Theory of Primitive Accumulation, the very last chapter of Volume 1 of Capital, is talking about the colonial system, and saying basically what the colonial system does is it finds itself forced to replicate capitalist social relations. And insofar as it does so, it doesn't actually solve the internal contradictions of capital. And what Marx is doing there is disputing Hegel in the Philosophy of Right, where Hegel kind of starts to talk about the internal contradictions and says, well, there are two ways you maybe can do it. You can redistribute from the rich to the poor, but then he kind of says, but the rich don't have enough to actually satisfy a mass of the poor, so we can't do that. And then he kind of says, well, maybe colonialism is the answer. And so there's a kind of very interesting passage in Hegel's Philosophy of Right where he kind of says the colonial system maybe can do it, and he doesn't actually then pursue that very far, but you get the impression that that's what Hegel's arguing. And Marx, of course, wrote one of his key texts was a critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. And he doesn't actually critique these passages, but actually all this argument here, and also at the end of Volume 1 of Capital, it kind of says, foreign trade doesn't solve the problem. It actually moves it around and spreads it to a wider scene. And this is also, of course, partly a response to Malthus. Malthus, in his Political Economy, argued that there is an effective demand problem, and the effective demand problem can be solved two ways. One, by having a class of people who do nothing but consume, but the other thing is by foreign trade. So what Marx is, I think, is refuting certain kinds of arguments that are around in political economy as to what the role of colonial systems and imperialism and all the rest of it might be in relationship to the internal contradictions of capitalism. And Marx is again in this little passage saying there's no foreign trade. So this is, I think, a very what I'm saying here is that this model has a lot of really restrictive assumptions in it, and to pretend it's realistic is crazy. It's not realistic at all, and so I think that then the question arises: if this is not meant as a realistic explanation, then what is its purpose? Now, one of its purposes, which comes up several times in the text, I don't know if you noticed this, but several times in the text, Marx says things like, well, if the associated producers were in charge, or if you had a socialist economy, or if you had a socialized economy, we could rationally work out all of these relations and you know, but what we're trying to do is to realize all of this through a market process, which is anarchic and incoherent and all over the place, and where market signals are not likely to guide you in such a way as to do the correct reinvestment decisions to get yourself into equilibrium. So if you like, the general argument tends to be, well, look, this system, these are the equilibrium conditions, and it's pretty clear that capitalism can't conform to them, therefore this is likely to be a source of crisis. But then we come to what happens when the credit system gets involved here. And that's why I think it's very, very interesting to read this chapter after having read the stuff on finance and credit. Because what does Marx say in those chapters on the credit? I mean, yeah, they're pretty incoherent, but he does say, I think, has some very important ideas. For one thing, he says, look, the credit system operates as the common capital of the class, right? And you then say to yourself, well, if it's functioning as the common capital of the class, why can you not imagine that somehow or other the credit system can somehow or other exercise a controlling power in relationship to all of this? Right? And remember also that the credit system played a very crucial role in dealing with things like turnover times and conflicts. And in a way, the disparities that are emerging here between these two sectors are analogous to those that arise over differential turnover time. In the differential turnover time and the fixed capital, you have a kind of temporal sort of thing. Here you've got, if you like, a sort of almost, it's not really spatial, but it sort of is spatial in its metaphor, a parallel of two sectors which are interacting in a certain kind of way. And what we need to do is to find ways to coordinate what's going on in one sector and another sector, and maybe the signals are going to be given by the credit system. Because, again, one of the things that goes on here is that there is no equalization of the rate of profit going on between these two sectors. They persist. And there's something very, very odd happens. Not only is the system expanding, but when you ask yourself the question, well, let's look at bourgeois consumption. And you see that actually bourgeois consumption is looking rather differently. If you look at the one here, they have 500 to spend. This lot down here have 600 to spend on their own consumption. Here, this goes up to 550. This goes down to 560. So the producers of wage goods are going to have to start to actually constrict their consumption a little bit. And so some very peculiar things start to come out of the figures as to what is actually going on here. And part of that comes out of the fact that you can't take surplus capital from sector one and put it into sector two. Now, this then brings us, if you like, to the whole kind of question of what happens with the credit system. And let me get into that a little bit, because I think it's very, very significant. If you go to 574, he says, if the surplus product directly produced and appropriated by the capitalists, and he has these AAAs and BBBs, you know, the AAAs are hoarding and the BBBs are not. It is, however, absolutely unproductive in its monetary metamorphosis as a hoard and as virtual money capital that is formed bit by bit. In this form, which is the hoarding form, which he here calls virtual money capital, It runs parallel with the production process but lies outside it. It is a dead weight on capitalist production. The attempt to make use of this surplus value that is being hoarded up as virtual money capital, either for profit or for revenue, culminates in the credit system and papers. In this way, money capital maintains an enormous influence in another form on the course of the capitalist system of production and its prodigious development. He then kind of says, you go to 576, as production expands, the formation of new money capital keeps in step with this expansion, and so the material for its hoarded form has also to be present. If this is true absolutely for the early phase of capitalist production, where the credit system is accompanied by a predominantly metallic circulation, it is just as true too for the most developed phase of the credit system, which still has metallic circulation as its basis. Of course, it no longer does, of course, but in his time it certainly did. On the one hand, the extra production of precious metals, according to whether this makes them abundant or scarce, can now exert a disturbing influence on the price of commodities, not only in the long term, but also within very short periods. On the other hand, the whole credit mechanism must constantly be engaged in restricting the actual circulation of metal by all kinds of operations, methods, technical devices, to what is relatively an ever-decreasing minimum. Well, it's now gone to zero, of course. Though this also increases in the same proportion the artificial character of the entire machinery and the chances of its normal course being disturbed. And then right towards the bottom, it is important above all, however, to start by assuming metal circulation in its most simple original form, since in this way the flux or reflux, settlement of balances, in short, all those aspects that appear in the credit system as consciously regulated processes, present themselves as existing independently of the credit system, and the thing appears in its spontaneous form instead of the form of subsequent reflection. So Marx wants to use the metallic circulation process because he sees that the credit system, for the reasons that we discussed, on the one hand it's critically necessary. On the other hand, it is also a potential source of disruption and speculative craziness. So this, I think, is significant. And then if you go to 580, and this is where he talks about these fellows, the role of merchants and money dealers and bankers and so on, but then only to dismiss them. And then there is a quite longish section where he talks about the question of credit again. Towards the bottom of 544, we also get into a situation where there's going to be perpetual relative overproduction. On the one hand, a greater quantity of fixed capital is produced than is directly needed. On the other hand, this is particularly important, a stock of raw materials is produced that surpasses the immediate annual need. This is particularly true of means of subsistence. Overproduction of this kind is equivalent to control by the society over the objective means of its own reproduction. Within capitalist society, however, it is an anarchic element. So you get this notion of anarchic element, and then what we start to see is the way in which capitalist production it draws in a whole set of questions about the credit system. Again on 554 at the top, he says, in this presentation we have presupposed the exclusive circulation of precious metals as money, and together with this the simplest form of cash purchases and sales. Though even on the basis of simple metallic circulation, money can function also as a means of payment and actually has functioned in this way historically, and a system of credit and certain aspects of the credit mechanism have developed on this basis. And then again, bottom of 555, there's a very interesting passage where he kind of says, well, when you're looking at the fluxes and refluxes of money which take place on the basis of capitalist production, the advances of fixed capital, he talks about those. He talks about hoard formation that is completely different in nature from the hoard formation based on the new gold production of each year that accompanies it. The different lengths of time for which money has to be advanced, which vary according to the length of the production periods of commodities, and for which there has been, in each case, a prior formation of a hoard before the money can be withdrawn from circulation by the sale of the commodity involved. The varying times of advance that arise simply from differences in the distance of the point of production from the market outlet, as well as the variation in the size and period of the reflux according to the condition of the relative size of the production stocks in different businesses, and for the different individual capitalists of the same line of business, dates of purchase, all these different aspects of the spontaneous movement had only to be noted and brought to light by experience in order to give rise both to the methodical use of the mechanical aids of the credit system and to the actual fishing out of available loan capital. Now, what I want to signal by this is that actually there is a very ambivalent relationship in these chapters to how to position the credit system in relationship to what's going on. And it's pretty clear to me that by the time you go through and you sort of pull out all of these little squibs about the nature of the credit system and what it's about, that if you wanted a realistic model of how this whole thing works, then there's no way you can come at it in terms of a realistic model without actually invoking and starting to integrate into it the way in which the credit system actually transforms many of these basic relations. The other place where there's, I think, a very interesting intervention of the credit system, just to consolidate that, Marx talks at the bottom of 568 that there are several points at which money is withdrawn from circulation and accumulated in individual hoards or potential money capitals, and that this appears as an equal number of obstacles to circulation because they immobilize the money and deprive it of its capacity for circulation for a longer or shorter time. And then he talks about the way in which the quantity of money you need is greater than that which is technically required. There always has to be a reserve of some kind. But then follows the little paragraph on 569 where he says, it is easy to understand the satisfaction evinced when the credit system concentrates all these potential capitals in the hands of banks, etc., makes them into disposable capital, loanable capital, i.e. money capital, no longer passive and as it were a castle in the air, but active, usurious, proliferating capital. So you get this language here which is about active, usurious, proliferating capital, which is playing a very significant role in the, quote, prodigious development of capital. So, to me anyway, this relationship between what's going on in these accumulation schemas and what's going on in terms of the development of the credit system is very, very significant. Now, I've mentioned that these accumulation schemas are very much admired by some economists, even though they would recognize that, you know, when you take the algebraic version of it, you can start to work with very intricate mathematics. But the kinds of things you can start to do, of course, is to relax some of the assumptions. Not necessarily the two-class model, but certainly the kind of question of what is the reinvestment function, what is the reinvestment volume, and what happens when you start to relax the idea that everything is internalized within either section, Department 1 or Department 2. And as you build the different mathematical models, you will find all kinds of things coming out. For instance, if you go to Michio Morishima's Marx's Economics, which is a very sophisticated mathematical inquiry into the qualities of these schemas. Mid-1970s, he was probably regarded as one of the top mathematical economists in the world. Well, one of the things he discovered was that when you take these schemas and start to play with them, you can start to see all kinds of different dynamics, which could be, I think, very interesting from the standpoint of the macroeconomic process of growth. For example, one of the versions he constructed showed very clearly, as he says, the balanced growth is unstable, and an economy starting from an initial point away from the balanced growth path will diverge from it as time goes on. In other words, there's nothing going on here which is going to bring you back to an equilibrium other than a crisis. And then he goes on and says, in more detail, we have explosive oscillations around the balanced growth path if Department 2, producing wage and luxury goods, is higher in the value composition of capital, or more capital intensive, than Department 1, producing capital goods. Otherwise, we have monotonic divergence from the balanced growth path. So, depending upon the value composition of capital, or the organic composition of capital in the two departments, you either get sort of oscillations which are kind of going like this, or in the other case, where Department 1 is more capital intensive than Department 2, then you get monotonic divergence, which is a gradual sort of divergence from a balanced growth path. But I think Morishima in particular is very clear that he sees Marx's intent to show the impossibility of balanced growth in a capitalist society. And that therefore this gives an added role to what crises are about. Crises are about bringing you back to some kind of equilibrium position. That's why crises are functional, if you like, internal to capitalism. That they, you know, a non-crisis prone capitalist system is not feasible. This is Marx's conclusion, and to some degree Morishima is agreeing with him, that the market system and the decision making that goes on inside of a market system is going to be of such a sort that you're going to diverge from balanced growth, and you're going to create a crisis, and the crisis is then going to say, well, how do you get back into some kind of balance? Now, of course, what then followed was macroeconomic thinking of the Keynesian sort, which kind of said, well, actually, if we have the right kind of policies and we pull the right levers, then we can actually get balanced growth over a sustained period of time, precisely by pulling the right levers. And this was, if you like, the theory that operated after World War II. And to some degree, if you look at the growth path then, there were not the fierce business cycles that there had been before World War II. And to some degree, people would argue that actually that came about for a variety of reasons. One was there was macroeconomic policy making, which, using this kind of thinking, was able to sort of say, all right, there seems to be some imbalance here, then what are we going to do? And you would use the taxation system, or you would use in some cases you use subsidies, or you would use the state to push up, for example, the demand for consumer goods. You would try to stimulate certain patterns of consumption. In this country, for example, through suburbanization and the rise of sort of a homeowner society, that you would use those kinds of strategies to stabilize the whole system. And between 1945 and 1973, there were certainly problems at various times. There were serious kind of recessions, but at the same time there were also, if you like, the main business cycles, particularly around fixed capital formation. Before World War II, there were usually long cycles of fixed capital formation, 15 to 18 years kind of cycles, but they seem to have disappeared in the 1950s and 1960s, partly through macroeconomic management. Now, since, of course, the 1970s, we've not been using the same tools and not the same macroeconomic management, although in some instances that's there, and you certainly see it going on in China right now. But the tendency has been to kind of say, well, let the market do it, and we just use monetary mechanisms, and we don't try this game of Keynesian interventionism. But I think that Marx himself is periodically going back into this kind of idea that actually, for instance, way back on page 500, this is where he's talking about the internal kind of movement of constant capital. He says, if production was social instead of capitalist, it is evident that these products of Department 1 would be no less constantly redistributed among the branches of production in this department as means of production according to the needs of reproduction. One part directly remaining in the sphere of production from which it emerged as a product, another part being shifted to other points of production, and so there would be a constant to and fro between the various points of production in this department. So he's saying that social coordination is possible. And that idea comes up a number of times in these two sections, which suggests that, I earlier indicated that the theory of capital that Marx is using here is very much about the idea of the social relation between capital and labor in production, and that therefore the essential kind of Marxian antidote is worker control by the associated workers controlling the production process. But here, again and again, he's suggesting some social mechanism has to exist to somehow or other direct decision-making, because worker-controlled entities are not necessarily going to be in a better position than say, ordinary capitalist entities to act in such a way as to somehow or other deal with the macroeconomic requirements of a sophisticated and complicated society. And I think one of the issues that we would therefore have to face in any kind of question of an anti-capitalist transition is precisely the kind of question of what kind of ways can coordination be set up. And it's always been presumed that the coordination would be done through the state apparatus. Marx doesn't actually make that claim here, that the state is going to do it, but then the question arises, if the state does not do it, then how is it going to be done? By what mechanisms? And that is where I think actually Marx's argument, again, in the credit section is kind of potentially interesting, when he kind of says, well, joint stock companies could have the capacity to do this sort of thing. And actually, if you look at the way in which large corporations producing means of production actually organize their inputs of other means of production, then they don't go and get them through the market. They essentially have a kind of a sort of a commodity chain structure in which they basically send orders down through the commodity chain and say, we need so many tons of steel, and the steel people say they want so many tons of iron ore, and so there's a sort of a chain of command. So a lot of capitalist organization right now does actually address this kind of question by forms of what you were talking about earlier, kind of cooperation of a certain sort, but it's not cooperation in the sense of equality. It's cooperation in the sense of a command and control structure in which, say, a particular corporation which wants so much of this or so much of that and so on will send out through its to its subsidiaries, its filières as they're called, its subsidiaries, how much we need. And if you can organize it then on a just-in-time kind of flow process, you can eliminate many of these questions. So one of the interesting kind of questions, I think, which arose out of that, what seemingly crazy kind of suggestion in Volume 2 of Capital, that we should look for the joint stock company as the beginnings of the socialization of the production process, could in fact be sort of revitalized right now by kind of saying, well, let's look at how many of these large-scale companies actually organize, deal with this whole kind of question of the circulation of goods within Department 1, for example. And whether there's ways in which it can be done without necessarily having the state intervene, but that particular producer will announce to all suppliers. And actually this issue is coming up even in some of these radical organizations now called solidarity economies. That if you have a solidarity economy and you're producing some goods and you're in southern Brazil, you may need supplies, and you find another solidarity economy in northeast Brazil and say, well, actually we need so many of this or so much of that in order to produce what it is we're producing. So there's beginning to emerge, as it were, coordinating mechanisms which could be coordinated through the internet and so on. In this case, it would be coordinating mechanisms between units which are relatively egalitarian in relationship to each other, and that would be the theory of a solidarity economy. But you can also imagine a situation where, say, somebody who's producing a final product but needs the inputs, the inputs, people can't sort of say, well, we'll think about it. No, maybe we'll send it next week or 2 years' time or whenever we feel like doing it. There's a certain kind of set of obligations that then have to arise. So I think the sense of this, for me, would be very much around this idea of somehow or other recognizing that in a complex society there are coordinations that need to be established if we're not to end up with chronic inefficiencies, and if we're not going to end up with bad timing, which is going to mean overproduction of this and underproduction of that. So the big question, it would seem to me, which has been really, I think, put on the back burner for a very long time, is because we're no longer allowed to talk about planning. That's a bad word. That's socialist or something like that. And you have these very interesting kind of conversations. When I was at Oxford, I used to sit down with big name people at dinners sometimes, and they didn't know who I was, and they would talk. And it was amazing when they get on Oxford High Table, they talk about all kinds of things they wouldn't talk about normally. And I was having a discussion with a guy who was complaining about the transport system of southeast England, and I kind of said, well, you mean you want better planning? He said, no, we don't want any planning. No planning, no planning. And so I said, and then I said, well, what do you want? And he described what he wanted. And I said, that sounds to me like planning. He says, no, we don't want any planning. No, we just need, I've forgotten the exact phrase. It was something like, we need the coordination of compatible and incompatible interests. And I said, oh, that sounds like planning. And of course, this is the high point of Thatcherism, so you couldn't. But the thing here is that actually, at this point, if you're looking at like something like, and this was one of the big problems in southeast England at the time, that Margaret Thatcher, having abolished the London County Council, or the Greater London Council because it was socialist, the result was there was no coordinated planning for the southeast England. And the result was the transport system was getting in a total mess and a total muddle, and nobody knew, and actually business folk were having a hard time. They couldn't get to work on time. They couldn't live in their Sussex mansion, so they were beginning to rave on and on and on about the inefficiencies of everything, and that's where you sort of get this coordination of compatible and incompatible interests. So these issues arise, and I think that actually at the macro level there is also a kind of question of can you actually intervene in a national economy in some way where you can deal with these sorts of questions. For example, the Chinese, there's no question that they are intervening in a massive way in the macro economy along these kinds of lines. But there's a very interesting feature here of these particular schemas, which is carried over into the socialist folklore. That is, the leading edge in this is Department 1. In effect, what you see happening through here is that Department 2 is always adapting to Department 1. Now, there's no rationale given here why that should be the case. And in fact, there's no reason for it to be the case. You could just as easily reverse it. But the result of that has been that from the Stalin era onwards, all socialist planning has been really pushed by the idea that actually the production of means of production is the first place you really start, and then everything else will follow. That therefore, and if you look at the industrialization projects that were launched in the post-colonial societies, you look at the industrialization projects that were launched in Ghana and Nkrumah or wherever, all of them were about get your heavy industry in place. The Indian development plans were along those lines too. And in fact, one of the people who used this structure was an Indian planner, Mahalanobis, who used this kind of structure to start to think about the Indian 5-year plans. But there's a certain mythology that kind of says, you know, get your heavy industry in place and your infrastructure's in place and everything. So you've got to take care of Department 1, and then, you know, don't worry about Department 2, the consumer goods industry. Don't worry about that. That'll come later. Okay. And that's not necessarily the right way round. And now the Chinese, right, in response to the crisis, has been a vast infrastructural project, which is precisely about Department 1 investments. So there's vast investments going into fixed capital, infrastructures, building factories, building whole cities. There's a vast amount of that going on. And at some point or other, you find that there's a real problem in the consumption sector, which is not doing very well. So in the United States, for example, consumerism accounts for 70% of the GDP. In China, it's 35% of the GDP. So obviously, the Chinese are working with a development model which is seriously biased towards a Department 1 kind of strategy. And this has been going on since Stalin. And it's been going on in all the socialist countries, and it was adopted also not only so developmentalism in the third world and the post-colonial world was very much driven in this kind of way, and a lot of it didn't work. If you look at the sort of industrialization project of Ghana and building steel works and all this kind of stuff, it didn't work. And so there's a real set of questions here as to how we read this, but then also in terms of the political message we might take from it. And as I say, you know, in reading this, going back to the original, there's absolutely no reason given why Department 2 should follow in the wake of Department 1. None given at all. It's just that Marx arbitrarily decided that, to do it that way around. And you think, well, the history would have been if he'd arbitrarily decided it the other way around. I mean, no, it's very interesting. So these things, what's going on in these chapters is not harmless, has not been historically harmless. In fact, it's been, and it's not Marx's fault, but it's the way it's been read, I think. And so I think that's one of the things that we ought to, again, think about. So there are these features, I think, of this text, particularly these chapters, since they have been taken so much notice of by macroeconomic thinkers. But also it does pose this problem, which I think is a very significant problem of how do you coordinate all of these flows in a world where you actually drop a lot of these assumptions that Marx makes. For instance, no foreign trade. Well, what happens when you start to kind of look at the dynamics of foreign trade and imbalances that occur there? So, we have, if you like, a set of problems which are being identified here, and I think, I'm sure that many of you are kind of feeling, well, this is so abstract, I can't see how it actually relates to daily life. And that's true in a way, but on the other hand, I think you have to kind of stretch your minds to kind of say, well, what is it that's going on here that we really need to be thinking about if we are actually interested in the kind of politics of an anti-capitalist transition and what that anti-capitalist transition is being about? And for example, people on the left don't like this way of thinking at all these days. I think that's pretty fair, right? I mean, well, most of the radical thinking to the degree it's anarchist and to the degree it's autonomista and it's, you know, solidarity economy kind of stuff, doesn't want to think about the macro kind of coordinations that might be required or necessary. And then you kind of say, well, what makes you believe that actually, you know, individual, say, anarchist communes acting in their own self-interest and their liberty and freedom and all that kind of thing are actually going to do a bunch of things which are going to coordinate with each other in such a way that the whole world works well. And everybody gets fed and everybody has a house and everybody has decent health care and education. What makes you think that? And I think that what Marx is doing here is by raising this question of what's the relationship between what individual capitalists do and what the macro requirements are. I think we also would have to ask the question, what do individual decision-making units of any sort do in relating to some of these more macroeconomic kind of questions? And we can see what some of those macroeconomic questions are when you get to issues of, you know, energy, global energy use and global warming and all those kinds of questions, in which case you have to start to think about how these macro questions get facilitated. So I think Volume 2, in concluding on this note, is actually raising a set of very, very significant questions. And the problem, of course, is that it's raised in such a way that it's very difficult to grasp actually what the hell's going on. And Marx is kind of sort of pushing in all sorts of little bits and pieces at the edges about this or that. He's refusing to consider some of the real possibilities that might exist via the credit system or via state interventions or something of that kind that might actually therefore deal with some of the macroeconomic instabilities that he's clearly identifying here. But I think there are some very, very big kind of issues which are posed here and which we need to find some way to consider. Now there are some particular bits and pieces that I'd like to draw your attention to which are kind of interesting. And let me just mention a couple of them in the text. On page 516, Marx is talking actually about, he's really talking here about Adam Smith. He says, they say that the same money here realizes two capitals. The buyer, the capitalist, converts his money capital into living labor power, which he incorporates into his productive capital. On the other hand, the seller, the worker, converts his commodity labor power into money that he spends as revenue, which is precisely what enables him to sell his labor power over and over again and thus to maintain himself. His labor power is thus actually his capital in the commodity form, from which he constantly draws his revenue. Now, some of you may encounter something called human capital theory. Right. Actually, Adam Smith had this kind of theory, but in Adam Smith it's sort of understandable because, you know, human capital theory kind of says that the laborer can, you know, by training themselves and learning skills and all this kind of thing, can build capital inside of themselves and then can get return on that capital when they go into the market in some kind. Okay, so human capital theory. And Adam Smith sort of felt that was the case. And you can see that in an artisan society that might sort of work. That I work for somebody and I internalize all these skills and this kind of thing. I learn how to do things and then I go out on my own and I become a little capitalist because I've got those skills and I can actually convert those skills into, you know, commodities and then become a capitalist. So the transition from being an artisan worker to being a capitalist, it was very, very fuzzy, you know, particularly in the 18th century when Adam Smith is writing. So in a way you could understand why Adam Smith would have that kind of idea about things. But by the time you get to the mid-19th century, that independent artisan class is being kind of essentially more and more destroyed, if not totally destroyed. And Marx, of course, will have nothing of this idea that actually, and then he explains why, with his human capital theory. In point of fact, he says, labor power is his capacity, ever renewing and reproducing itself, not his capital. It is the only commodity that he can constantly sell, and he has to sell it in order to live. But it operates as capital, variable capital, only in the hands of the buyer, the capitalist. So the point is that the labourer can't make use of the skills and the abilities. The capitalist makes use of them. And so if the labourer is twice as productive as other labourers, then it's the capitalist who benefits, not necessarily the labourer. So Marx's point is kind of saying, to call, the labourer's skills their capital is a ridiculous proposition. So when people started to pick up all of this and started giving you all this language about human capital theory and what's the big guy in Chicago, Gary Becker, in Chicago, starts talking about human capital theory, and that therefore, we've got to invest in human capital and education, and it's all about capital, and then you're giving people capital, which they can then. Marx is saying that's rubbish. And actually, what Marx does in this little passage is to take a crack at human capital theory and dispute it. So I think it's kind of interesting to sort of go off and look at what is being said about human capital theory, and then and it's so different. I mean, because if it really was capital, the work and it generated a revenue, then the worker could just go to sleep in a hammock and presumably just get the interest on it, right? Marx is of course they can't do that. So to call it capital is ridiculous, because that choice is always open to the capitalist, right? Say, I'm fed up with working now. I've amassed my capital. I'm now just going to live off the revenue and the interest. So I mean, the capitalist got that choice. The worker does not have that choice, and this is Marx's point. So it's a very interesting little passage where he's essentially refuting Adam Smith's notion of human capital theory, which is taken up by Gary Becker and made a big thing of in a lot of contemporary economics. So that's one of the little snippets in here that I think is interesting. I think we've already dealt with the foreign trade stuff and the question of hoarding. And there's one other thing that I think I'd like to pay attention to, which comes up on page 591, where Mr. Capitalist, as well as his press, is frequently discontented with the way in which labour power spends its money, and with the commodities too in which it realises this. On this occasion, he philosophises, waxes cultural, and philanthropises, as, for example, Mr. Drummond, the British Secretary of Embassy in Washington. The Nation carried an interesting article. They still do carry articles like this, by the way, in which he is said, among other things, and then goes on about how working people have not kept up in culture with the growth of invention, and they have had things showered on them. I mean, this is amazing stuff, which they do not know how to use and thus make no market for. And then further, the problem remains how to raise him as a consumer by rational and healthful processes. Not an easy one, as his ambition does not go beyond a diminution of his hours of labour, the demagogues rather inciting him to this than to raising his condition by the improvement of his mental and moral powers. Again, that's going to be capital, human capital kind of argument. And then Marx mocks that by kind of saying long hours of labour seem to be the secret of these rational and healthful processes, which are to raise the condition of the worker by improving his mental and moral powers and making a rational consumer out of him. In order to become a rational consumer of the capitalist commodities, he must, before all else, for the demagogues prevent him, begin by letting his own labour power be consumed irrationally and in a way contrary to his own health by the capitalist who employs him. What the capitalist understands by rational consumption is shown when he is condescending enough to take a direct interest in the consumer behaviour of his workers, i.e. in the truck system. And then he talks about the Lawrence Mills and the boarding houses and all those kinds of things, the description of the ever-present piano, the working girl boarding houses. So I think that this question of working class consumption, what it's about now, what Marx is doing here, of course, is again kind of saying, look, the bargain between capital and labour in the market is simply this: we give you the value of your labour power and that's it. Then you have to work out what it is you need to survive. That's your problem, not mine. So this is, if you like, what we would call the externality kind of side of things, which I think I've mentioned before, the externality of social reproduction, which the capitalist class wants nothing whatsoever to do with. But at the same time, there is the presumption, always the presumption, in this model that the working class are going to spend it, are going to spend their money, and that they are going to engage in, quote, rational consumption. Rational, that is, from the standpoint of what it is the capitalists are producing. So that built into these models is, if you like, a theory of rational consumption on the part of the working class. And there's no escaping that there is a definition of rational consumption. But Marx is kind of saying that the capitalist is not actually concerned with that. All the capitalist is concerned with is giving people the value of labour power, and that's fixed. And in these models it's fixed, as we mentioned earlier. And generally speaking, throughout Capital, Marx tends to take it as fixed. And does so for a very interesting reason, which will come, which was there in the first class, which is that the actual wages that are paid, that's a fact of distribution, and therefore it's a particularity, and therefore outside of particular concern. So the issue that's raised here in this ironic way about rational consumption is a real issue. And so Marx is not denying the idea that there is rational consumption. He's simply, what he's doing is denying the way in which the bourgeois do-gooders were in effect trying to define what rational consumption was, and imagining therefore that actually the working class was having all this largesse sort of showered upon them in some way, and that they were not using it properly. Which of course was the question which was raised when Ford gave the sort of $5 8-hour working day, and then had to send in a lot of social workers into the workers' houses to make sure they consumed properly. You didn't want them gambling, and you didn't want them, all those kinds of things. It was not rational consumption. So keeping the workers on a consumer, on the right consumer trail becomes very, very significant, and you can see why that is from these schemas. If suddenly this money which is given out, this 1100 V, and all the workers collectively decided to go, blow it on a gambling spree or something like that, then the whole system would break down. And so this is a very interesting kind of thing, and of course this is where the Russell Sage Foundation came in. They were the social scientists that were hired to go into the workers' houses and make sure they weren't spending it on sex and drugs and rock and roll and God knows what, all the things you guys get into, sort of. So this idea is also something that's very significant, I think, in here. And Marx does talk about, very periodically, he kind of says, we assume workers consume all of their revenues, and they don't save, and they don't consume in a way that is outside of this dynamic. And that is, I think, a very important assumption. So I don't take this as a dismissal of the idea of rational consumption. What I do take it as is a dismissal of the idea that somehow or other, we can go and, somehow or other, like bourgeois philanthropy in relationship to working class consumer habits has been a long issue. And a big issue, actually, through the history of the bourgeoisie and through the history of capitalist society. And it's always surrounded with this kind of sense of moral superiority. If only these people would actually, realize that by using their resources and building their human capital, they could actually benefit. And Marx is kind of saying, both in terms of the human capital theory, but also in terms of the rational consumption, that's not going to be the case, given the nature of the capitalist class relation to labour. So do you have any kind of responses to these chapters you want to raise up? Yeah.
I want to say something about the coordination problem.
Yeah.
In my experience, many leftists that are seriously engaged in the cooperative movement have actually already understood that societal coordination is an important issue. I think it's the traditional split between the Marxist and central planning and the anarchist, just a small mini communities, that doesn't hold water anymore. I mean, for everyone that really thinks about these cooperatives, because small cooperatives, just faced with the market, they are drowned. If they're not embedded in one kind or the other not of central planning, of communal planning. And so my assumption would be the real reason why Marxism and anarchism has split is not on the problem of coordination. It's on the problem that Marxism has not developed a theory how to democratize the state. This is the weak point, where the anarchists say, rightly, the only thing that you provided is that kind of central planning that didn't lead to anything. But I think this lacking theory of how to democratize the state, just instead of just the idea we take over the state and then the state will wither away, and this was not sufficient and not helpful.
I agree very much about the way Marxists approached these kinds of questions, say in the 1950s, 1960s, which I think was precisely problematic for the reasons you suggest. What I'm trying to do is, in reading this, is to try to sort of say, well, okay, how do we then approach this question? Because I think the other side of it is a lot of worker control movements and worker cooperatives have failed. The ones that have survived, and I mentioned some weeks ago, the Mondragon one has survived. In part has survived because it has actually sought to take command over the credit institutions by setting up its own credit structures, and also to some degree has tried to integrate a retailing structure with a, so they have, so I think it's very, very important to look at those that have survived. I mean, the whole history of worker control has been, successful for a bit, and even as something as which had a lot of prospects for survival, like the Israeli kibbutz, has gradually sort of disintegrated into something that is radically different for a variety of reasons. But so I think, so I don't disagree with you, about the line of thinking, but I think a lot more attention has to be paid to the theory of the transition, if you like, and what has to be built in order to move towards an alternative kind of production and consumption system. And I think that, again, part of what I'm trying to read into Marx here is to kind of say there are necessary preconditions for a transition to occur. I'm as suspicious of the state as you are, and I'm therefore not in favor of saying automatically, well, the state should do it. But on the other hand, you have to think of some organizational form that has the capacity to do it, which is why I'm saying, well, we should be looking inside of US corporate configurations. One of my favorite would be we should look inside of Walmart, see how they actually set up their delivery and service. I mean, it's not a great, in terms of its social relations, it's a disaster, and for all sorts of reasons. But in terms of its technical capacities to coordinate production, consumption, it's a massive kind of organization. What would happen if we had a collective taking over of Walmart? Yeah.
I'm wondering if, because this whole thing, what we see about capitalism is this motion of value, this motion of exchange. Now, how I mean, if you go into, and I'm just asking because I don't know, or like, you know, if value wasn't in motion like it was in feudal times and pre-capitalist economies, and then so say you have a post-capitalist economy, you know, one of the sort of more abstract things you can ask is, what is the relation of value in central planning? What is the relation of these flows? I mean, it's still, I mean, you get into that paradox where like you want to centrally plan, but we still talk in terms of these sort of semi-autonomous flows and these, you know, the levers of Keynesianism and central planning. So, I mean, at what point does that value sort of, is it still autonomous and you have to hands off and sort of direct it, or how does that motion of value happen? Does that make sense? Forgive me.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, Marx's answer, and you know, is that money would disappear and that therefore the value form would disappear. What that would mean is that the coordinations would have to be done in use value, have to be done in physical kind of terms. How many houses do you need? You know, and how many, you know, how much steel do you need? It wouldn't be a value flow. And this is the kind of interesting thing about what happened here. Remember, Marx at the outset kind of said, you've got to think about value flows and you've got to think about material coordinations. The material coordinations here have disappeared, actually. And the only way in which they actually are present here is in terms of the distinction between means of production and wage goods. Two vast material defined categories.
The use value is almost incidental to them.
Yes, but the rest of it, use value, disappears. So after that, that's where you get into the Leontief kind of input-output analysis. Physically, how much do you need? You know, how much steel do we need to produce to build the bridges? You know, those kinds of things, and how many bridges do we need? You know, I mean, those kinds of things. So it becomes a use value, and you can do it in physical terms. Actually, you really can, and you can also, and there is a distinction which could carry over between productive consumption and individual consumption. So you could continue to use some distinction of that kind and say, look, we need commodities to produce other commodities that produce commodities that then produce consumption. But how would we model that? So it would become a physical thing. So Marx's answer, I think, it says a couple of times, so we wouldn't have money around to do these coordinations, so that wouldn't, and the value theory would disappear. Now there is an important thing to understand about value theory in Marx. It's distinctive to capital. This is capital's way of valuing things. Socially necessary labor time. And one of the objections you would have to taking some sort of that and then trying to use that in planning would be that actually you're simply perpetuating the capitalist theory of value in another form. So if you try to model it in value terms, you're actually using the capitalist valuation system to do it. So I think, and there's another notion, there are completely different notions of value that might be involved, which would be very disparate and wouldn't have the capacity of the contemporary value operation, which in effect has a factory open up in China and one in Ohio closed down, irrespective of the social and environmental and other consequences. Those decisions would be made on different grounds. So it's physical coordinations, I think, and also social determinations of what is considered a decent lifestyle by a mass of people. You know, I mean, what do we really need? Do we need more and more and more, or is there a sense in which we can say, well, this is an adequate material base for daily life? Now we can, you know, have a 10-hour work week and the rest of the time just, you know, hang around and shoot the breeze and do all those kinds of things instead of doing what everybody does now, which is run around like crazy, you know, sort of. So I think that is the answer I see Marx proposing here.